Hello again, everybody. It's your friendly neighborhood master, Alan, and I'm today going to introduce you to a concept called Mushin No Shin. Now, that's a Japanese phrase that translates a couple of different ways, but most of the time it gets translated as mind without mind, or mind with no mind, or no mindedness. And that's something that a lot of people have difficulty translating into words that they can conceptualize. And so if we say mind with no mind, a lot of people interpret that different ways. One of the most common ones is that people sort of assume no-mindedness sort of goes along with impulsiveness or brashness. And so we'll back up for just a second and go to the Book of Five Rings, which is the place where a lot of people get introduced to no-mindedness for the first time. And now, there was a samurai in Japan named Miyamoto Musashi, and Musashi wrote a book called the Book of Five Rings, or the Five Scrolls. Now, the Gorin no Sho, which was the title of that when he wrote it, features the five elements that the samurai sort of believed in at the time. And those five were fire, water, earth, air, and void. And void is something that can be a little bit difficult to translate because it means nothing. And so it's a word to describe nothing. And so the last book of the Book of Five Rings, the Void book, talks about no-mindedness. Now, we actually talk about no-mindedness in a lot of contexts, professionally, athletically, and other things. And so no-mindedness, what that's about, is being able to respond calmly under pressure. And so when Musashi talks about Mushin No Shin in the Book of Void, what he's talking about is things that we describe as flow, things that we describe as intuition. And so there are lots of different ways that we can sort of put this into our modern context and into our linguistic context so that we can kind of compare apples to apples. Otherwise, if we're just saying mind without mind, we don't really have a good image or immediate grasp of the state that that's talking about. So a concept that gets talked about occasionally is flow. If someone is in the flow of something. And so athletically, we'll talk about a player being in the flow of the game or having a feel for the game. The opposite of that is we'll talk about somebody being in their head. And so a player might be in their head. And so if somebody is sort of having to process what they're seeing so that they can decide on their action, that's what we sort of describe as somebody being in their head. And so then they're always sort of a step behind, because by the time they've looked, processed, made a decision about what their action needs to be, well, events have already happened, and so now they're a step behind and they're having to react later instead of more immediately. If someone professionally, so if a business is trying to make a decision, then there's being able to analyze information to make an informed decision. But there's the other side of that coin of not acting with enough urgency, and so then being too late to make an adaptation. And so we talk about businesses that their industry was changing and they didn't adapt fast enough. And so that's sort of the same thing. It's that being too rigid or too fixed or too malleable, or making a choice that was too late to be able to affect things. And now, for us, Mushin No Shin, no-mindedness, flow, feeling things. We have a lot of examples of this. When you work with kids, you get to see a lot of ways that they go from having to process something in order to do it to being able to just do it. And so when kids are learning to ride their bikes or skateboards or scooters, there's the process at the beginning where they don't have a good understanding of how to balance or how to steer. And so there's lots of errors, there's lots of falling, there are lots of ways that we help them kind of gain an understanding of that balance until eventually they sort of make the jump of being able to bike. And at first they may need to be really concentrating on their hands in order to keep themselves pointed in a straight line. Or they may need to be, balanced in a certain way so that they can go a certain speed. And they can't go too fast because then they feel uncomfortable and start overthinking again. But they also can't go too slow because then it becomes very difficult to balance. And so there's this middle zone that's very hard for them to keep at first until they get more comfortable. They can be more in the flow and have an understanding of how to use their body's balance to balance the bicycle or to balance the skateboard. And so martial arts, we have lots of little ways that we introduce you to the idea of being able to stay in your body instead of having to go into your head and having to process what's happening. And different drills give people different levels of having to all of a sudden process instead of being able to feel. One of the most stark ones is multiple attack drills, because someone might be very, very comfortable doing all of their material within the context of different drills. But then all of a sudden, when they have to keep track of multiple opponents, they have to spend so much time thinking about and processing the location of everything that they end up behind the action and get overwhelmed very easily. And so how you arrive at no-mindedness is both an understanding of breathing and your body, but also being able to catch yourself when you start having to think through what you're doing instead of being able to just feel your way through it and just do it. Okay? When you see that the stove is on fire, it's not productive to stand there and stare at the fire and wonder what you should do. But when panic happens, that's something that happens to a lot of us. So martial arts training, we're working on helping you process through panic as quickly as possible or skip that part and panic afterwards, which is also what happens with practice for athletes or training for soldiers. A big part of basic training in the military is to help a soldier learn how to react and respond immediately in a way to protect their lives and the lives of their compatriots, rather than having to think about what to do, being able to just do it, because when bullets are whizzing, there's not enough time to think about it. You have to respond very immediately. Law enforcement, firefighters, EMTs, people that deal with emergency situations, emergency room nurses and operators and doctors and so forth. People that are in these environments where you have to make decisions very, very quickly without being able to take a lot of time to sit, look, and analyze, and needing to sort of see, feel, respond. It's same types of training. So from a self-defense standpoint, what that means is the martial art that you're training in isn't the important part. But what that martial art should be doing is teaching you how to use yourself and your balance as a tool to do certain things. And so your punches and your back, like your front two knuckle punches and your back two knuckle punches and your kicks and your grapples and your fells and all that stuff. All those things exist to help you learn how to use your body to affect somebody else's body and how to protect your space and how to move and stay balanced. And so even something as direct and simple as boxing, which in boxing there are a very, very limited number of strikes that you can do because there are certain areas of the hand you're not allowed to strike with. And there are certain ways that you're not allowed to strike with your hand. And so the rules and the limitations of boxing make it so that the toolbox for boxing is very, very specific in terms of what you can do with your hands. And what you can do with your feet is also really, really precise, because if you make the wrong decision, then the other person has a much easier road to knocking you out. And so learning how to use your feet in conjunction with your hands to be able to deliver power to make sure that you don't get hit. And so training in a way where you're delivering power with your body, you're not receiving power from the other person's body into your anatomy, where internal organs that don't deal with kinetic energy very well. And so Mushin No Shin, no-mindedness, flow, feel. These are all just words for intuition and being able to quickly shift out of assessing your situation and into acting in your situation. That's what it's about. And so the next time you're in a drilling class, whether you're practicing animals or techniques or blocking or punching or kicking, there are going to be some things that you don't have to think about at all. You can just do them. And there are going to be other things that you have to remind yourself what to do, or you're calling up information to be able to do the correct thing. And you want to recognize the times where you're flowing and understand what it feels like, because that's the target. That's where we want to try to be as much of the time as possible. Other times, we're having to think, remember, self-assess. And in those times, when you're working on something new, that's part of the process. But you want to ultimately achieve the goal of being able to feel. And so then, especially at very high levels, you might be executing something and then you'll look at an instructor and say, did I do that right? And the instructor will then look right at you and say, how'd it feel? Because you're the one that can then say whether it felt genuine or didn't. And that's the way that you can improve yourself and teach yourself. And that's a part of what Mushin No Shin is. That's what no-mindedness is being able to learn from the feeling of your body. And if something felt powerful or wasn't, if something felt balanced or if it felt off balance, if something felt immediate or if it felt sluggish. These are all things that we learn about ourselves as we train, and that our material teaches us about ourselves and our bodies. And so all of the exercises, everything we do, even when we have you practice something in a way that you wouldn't necessarily utilize it in a real situation, a lot of times we're training some other component. An example of that is like elbow position. So when I have my hands in elbow position, I'm not doing this because I want to punch from here. This isn't a great place to hold my hands if I'm in a self-defense situation. The reason why I've got my hands here is so that I'm training the muscles in my back to connect my fist through my arm, through my core, and into my legs. So that I'm not punching with my arm, I'm punching with my body. And martial arts styles that don't use elbow position are still going to teach people to do that same thing. They're just going to do that a different way. Because there's no martial art that wants you to hit just with your arm disconnected from the rest of you. Every martial art is teaching you how to take your body and send your hand out to deliver power. And that's what no-mindedness is about. It's being able to send this out where I need it to go, the way I need it to, maintaining my balance. It's like driving a car. When you first learned how to drive, there's a lot of tight gripping the steering wheel and thinking through all your actions and being very hesitant and being very nervous about making mistakes. Because when you're first driving a car, there is a lot of possibility for catastrophic event if you do something wrong. And so there's a lot of hesitance there. But as you get more comfortable, then you can survey what's going on around you and collect information about the other cars that are on the road with you in a different way, where you can feel how you fit in with the flow of traffic. And that's Mushin No Shin. It can be the thing in your kitchen that you've made 1,000,000 times before, and you'll be halfway through the prep before you even realize you were sort of doing it without thinking about it. You were just going through your steps and you got everything done. A lot of times, tasks like mowing the lawn, where we're doing something over and over, we can get to where we're completing the action correctly without having to think about it, without having to analyze it and process it and reflect and react and all those sorts of things. In training, there's a lot of importance to being able to analyze. In application, there's a lot of importance to being able to take the analysis and set that to the side. Analysis is our coach. Action is our player. And that's another way to think about it. So this is just a little bit about Mushin No Shin, mind with no mind. And martial arts can help you do that, not just in emergency situations, But if you learn how to seek that state, then you can use it other places as well where it's valuable. Thanks for watching.